Dashboard. No, I got nothing new here. Okay, so let me see what I can do here. I apologize, Andrew, but this is why we got a couple minutes in the morning to check things out. And it's still saying, oh, now it says streaming. Now it says streaming. Now we'll find out if we got something. It should be up any moment now. And my live one here, it says live on this end. Get shareable. I'm just double checking. And it says, yep. Okay, folks, let's do this again. Good morning, good morning, good morning. YouTube had a hiccup, but we figured it out. We just had to wait. Sorry about that, everybody. And now we have YouTube comments coming in, so we're good. We're good. And how's the audio and video for you? It looks good. Wonderful. So, folks, I found the focus on my camera, and I spent a lot of time yesterday moving the Starlink Gen 2 to a different location. I had to do a lot of networking. I had to get the cable. I had to do a lot of work for you. Did it make a difference? Am I pixelated J anymore? Looks like on my end, I'm good. Good morning. Good morning. And I'm so excited today. This is a really, really big day for me. This is one of those make it or break it days for me. I'm so excited with our guest today. And oh my gosh, everybody's showing up. We got Jason, Paula, and everyone. And don't forget Andrew. Andrew's here. I can see him. He's hanging out, and we'll be bringing him in early. He does have to leave by 7:30, which is absolutely fine. We're absolutely prepared to go through a whole bunch of subjects with him, and we'll get it done in time. So thanks for that heads up. Hey, good morning, Mayor. Nice to see you. Nice to see you. Sorry about that delay on YouTube, everybody. Good morning, True. Nice to see you, buddy. And we got Ali. Good morning, Ali. Thanks a lot for your help this morning. And we got Padge. Good morning, all. And I'm going through them quick because Andrew is in the lobby, so I'm going to bring him in. Motown, I like your calendar. Is it Friday? That's true. That's true. I didn't even notice that. All right, folks. Without further ado, it's Andrew Lawton. Okay, you know who he is. I don't really have to tell you who he is. He wrote a book about the Freedom Convoy. He is on True North. He did the election coverage. He is on Mark Stein's show as well. I believe he's a producer, but we'll get into that. He's an independent journalist, and he's just an all-around great guy. He gives us all a good name, independent journalists like me, because when you watch his stuff, he isn't in your face. He's not yelling at you. He is not being crude or rash. He's being very kind, in my opinion, and I really like that approach. You get a lot more, you attract a lot more bees with honey than vinegar, and this is something I've always noticed in the legal profession. The lawyers who are really, really good at their job, they're not scary and intimidating to meet. They're actually very, very easy to talk to, and that's the point. Okay, you can have people open up and be a lot more free with what they want to talk about. If you don't approach them in a negative way, you don't put them on guard or on defense. You go up there with a smile because you generally just wanted to talk to the person and get information. And Andrew is a star at that. There's no doubt. I don't see anything coming out of him that makes me go, oh, I wish he just relaxed on that one or something. He's really good. And then his commentary and his coverage of the election was wonderful. So we just had that on Monday, so just a couple of nights ago. So we'll definitely get some good information from him about the behind the scenes and, of course, his take on the election. All right, so without further ado, Andrew, let me go ahead and bring you in, my friend. Hello, good morning.
Good morning. This is really awkward. I was about to yell at you and be in your face this morning, but now you've ruined my bit there by saying I don't do that.
Well, if you want to try, be one of the first times we'll see it.
No, I'm not good at it. I've got like the Andrew Scheer problem, which is that I just look too happy all the time. So it's hard to sometimes take me seriously as like the fierce, angry guy. But it means when I do get fired up on my show, it has more impact because it's like people don't see it often. I find that if you're at 11 all the time, people can't really distinguish. And I think that's where for me personally, anyway, I've tried to really try to find the positive side, not because I'm an optimist, but just because I think, it just is not constructive or productive if you're always at that one level. But everyone's got their own style.
Absolutely. And there is two sides. It's not like it's an incorrect side. But there is two sides. So being a positive and looking for the positive and trying to get that information out, I think is a good way to do it. You don't have to get through a defense first. And that's why on the legal side, it works well. So if you make somebody comfortable, you make them feel good on the stand or in an interview, you don't come in aggressive, they don't get defensive. But it also means they may tell you things maybe they shouldn't. But it's a good way to work with people. And I really liked that you do that. That's just your nature, and it really helps people like us who are trying to become independent journalists as well. That we have somebody that we can point to as a very good example of what an independent journalist does, versus the other examples that are a little bit louder and more crass, which of course the traditional media will point to as a typical journalist, independent journalist. So thank you very much for trying to break that mold for us, and I really appreciate it. I do follow in your footsteps on that front.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
And I don't want to fanboy you here, okay? But I'm pretty excited about today. I read your book. It's I got a couple things I want to talk to you about. It inspired me to write a book as well. So thank you for being here today, Andrew. But let's go ahead and let everybody else know who you are. I'm sure a good chunk of the people watching know who you are, but let's go ahead and let them know what got you into journalism and got you to this point today.
So it was a bit of a roundabout way. I mean, I don't think you need to go to, quote unquote, journalism school to be a journalist. But even so, it was never my intention when I went to school. I initially studied political science at Western in London. And I was always interested in politics, at least going back to high school. And then afterwards, I just took a very sort of meandering route and ended up blogging. And at the time, it was probably 2008, 2009. Blogging was kind of emerging as this political thing. And it was this strange little novelty that people had. It was this idea of like being a professional blogger didn't exist. It would have been laughable. I think like the most I ever made in those early years was maybe like $20 that someone sent me in, PayPal or something. And that was exciting to me. It's like, ooh, I've made money from blogging. And then that sort of morphed into podcasting. And we're talking about around 2010 here. And it was really this perfect opportunity because it was just becoming popular, the idea of a podcast, but it was still very niche. And it was also something where the demand was much larger than the supply. And it was just a university friend of mine and I that started doing this. We took our blog and just turned it into a podcast. And we had just tapped into this vein that really there was a market for. And we were doing a lot of crossover Canadian and American conservative political content. And we amazingly were just kind of an overnight success in that realm, in that world. And, we had really, really incredible guests on in our space early on. Like we had Ann Coulter on our third episode, and we had, Mark Stein. That was kind of around the time that I first met him. We had Andrew Breitbart on, who's now, of course, passed away. We had Ben Shapiro, who he's not as big as he is now, but still pretty big. And we had, and every one of these guests that we had on would sort of give us credibility to get the next guest. So it got to the point where we're trying to book these big names, and we're like, oh, we've also had so-and-so on. And they're like, oh, well, if they've been on, we'll come. And again, still no money in it whatsoever, but we were getting like hundreds of thousands of listens to this show and having a hugely fun time doing it. And at the time, independent media, to bring it full circle here, was still this weird phenomenon because you were kind of just like nose pressed up against the glass of the real media. And, everyone that I was meeting in the blogger and podcast communities all secretly wished that they could have worked for a newspaper or a radio station. And I was very fortunate in that I did have a local radio station where I live in London, Ontario, come to me and say, hey, would you like to do a daily talk show, which at the time was just a dream come true. So I did it, and I kept doing the blogging and podcasting a little bit, but my focus was on my radio show. And then, of course, that sort of triggered this media career that I have today. I was, guest hosting in Toronto. I was guest hosting, oddly, for Danielle Smith on 770 in Calgary, and she and I worked very closely there, and occasionally doing some other stuff as well and writing columns. And now, just to bring this long story to a close, it all comes full circle. Go back to independent media and have a lot more fun than I ever did in the traditional media side.
That's wonderful. Now we have a term too called citizen journalist and then independent journalist. To you, what's the difference between the two? Is there a difference?
I think that an independent. This is my own answer that I'm coming up with,
Mhm.
having not thought about this. But when you give me that prompt, my initial instinct is that an independent journalist is still doing it in a professional context. Like they're still doing it either for work, I mean, they could be doing it for themselves for work, but they're still doing it for work. Whereas a citizen journalist, I believe, is more of a function than a job. Like anyone can go out and, as a citizen, be a journalist. I mean, it's like a citizen's arrest. You're not a professional law enforcement officer, but when the moment arises, you take on that role as a citizen.
Mhm.
So that would be my view. But again, I also realize that, if someone is a citizen journalist, every night from 5 o'clock to 9 o'clock, and they're not doing it as a job, yeah, I would call them an independent journalist as well.
Right.
But that would be my distinction, because to me, the independent simply means you're not beholden to the government. You're not beholden to one of these giant corporate media entities. Whereas the citizen aspect just means you're not doing it for work, in my view.
Yeah, I think we have a very similar approach to that. To me, it would be a spontaneous journalist, would be a citizen one.
Mhm.
So something happened, you grabbed your camera and you took a video, or you reported it, or you witnessed it. So something happened. You weren't there for the purpose of journalism, but it happened. Whereas an independent journalist would be there for the purpose of journalism. So they arrive to the event for the purpose of journalism. And then, of course, there's the mainstream traditional journalism where you're hired and you have accredited
Mhm.
credentials and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think that that's kind of the progression. So if anybody is on the scene for something, be a journalist. You would be a citizen journalist at that stage. If you capture something and report it. And if you like that, you can become an auditor, which is somebody that follows the police and authorities to see if they're doing good things, or just not just, or an independent journalist who's bringing forward the truth from their eyes. Um,
Mhm.
so one of the things I really enjoyed about you is it. Do you have a producer? Do you have somebody who's telling you what to say? Because it doesn't seem like it.
Well, telling me what to say, no, and that's the whole point of being an independent journalist.
Mhm.
Certainly helping, yes. I've got a producer and videographer that works behind the scenes to do the technical stuff on my show. He also will send story ideas, and oftentimes will help in booking guests, especially if it's not someone I've got a relationship with. But it's. I've never been one of these broadcasters that likes to just sort of sit down at the microphone or in front of the camera and just have no idea what's on that show today until I look at the sheet
Right.
that someone else has put in front of me. And that's certainly in the cable news realm. I think a big problem is you get people that are hosting shows where they don't even know what's on it. They have no investment in it. They're literally just trained monkeys reading a teleprompter. Now, I
Mhm.
once tried to read a teleprompter I was doing a speech, and I'm like, I'm going to be really professional and proper here. And I'm going to like write my speech. And I got a teleprompter app on my iPad I had at the time. And I was like, I'm going to set it up and I'm going to read the speech properly. And I hated it. Because I was like
Yeah.
coming up with better material when I was standing up at the podium than I was when I was sitting down writing the thing. So I'm like, screw this. I'm never reading anything again, as far as like a teleprompter goes. And when I sit down on my show, I've got a list of topics that I want to get through. I sometimes will like write down, like, make sure to say this, because
Mhm.
otherwise I'll forget my best material. But no, I like to just sit down, and what you hear is me.
That's wonderful, and it reassures me that I'm kind of going about this the right way because that's exactly how I do the shows as well. I'll have points that I want to talk about. For example, I have a note in here about your book that I wanted to talk about. But other than that, if you don't know the subject matter, you won't be able to speak to the subject matter. So clearly, when you don't need a prompter, you know what you're talking about. So that's
Yeah,
very,
or,
very cool.
or you don't care if you sound like an idiot, I guess. Either it works both ways.
Ah, good point. Now, you certainly worked with CBC, CTV, all the big ones. So you've actually seen the complete difference between how they run and then how independent runs.
Well,
Um,
I would actually reject that slander. I have never worked with
oh,
CBC. The company
okay.
that I worked with was Global.
Oh, apologies. So you actually worked for Global, but were you on CBC? Like, did you appear on CBC? Okay.
I've appeared on CBC. I've appeared on CTV. Actually, I've appeared on BBC as well, which was quite fun. But no, I never worked for them. Just wanted to clarify
Okay.
that.
Thank you for
I,
clearing that
I was
up,
feeling the
Melanie.
blocks and the unfollows coming as soon as you said that.
Yeah, no, thanks for, and this is what independent media is about. Just correct it on the fly too. I knew
Yeah.
you had you were on the platform. I knew that much.
Yes, yes.
So what was it like for you to be on their platform and then also establish and create your own platform and then join another one like True North and Mark Stein?
It was pretty natural. I mean, just to go back to my radio experience, I mean, talk radio was always the most independent form of traditional media, in my view. It was always the place where you could have real discussions, you could have debates, you could have controversial thoughts. And in some cases, I think talk radio was designed to elevate those things. So when I started doing a talk radio show, I never had any filter that was put on me about what you can or can't say. I mean, there's sort of the regulatory side of, you can't, do certain things, and you've got defamation law and whatever. But I was never ever told, don't say this, don't say this. And then there was a change that happened at my radio station where Chorus, which is the company that owned it,
Mhm.
bought Shaw, which is, I mean, you'd know from being out in Alberta, big Alberta institution, and
Mhm.
Shaw owned Global. And what happened was my company bought Global, but all of the Global executives took over my company. It was basically a merger that was framed as an acquisition. And when that happened, there was an instant flip in the level of oversight and micromanaging that took hold over not just the radio division, but even my individual show and other shows, where I had like literally corporate executives, vice presidents that were involved in reviewing individual lines of columns and discussing content that was on show. It was actually quite insane just how many levels of management were involved. Now, I'm going to say I might have been more of a problem than some other people were in their view, but it wasn't because I was saying anything all that terrible. I think they just had a very micromanaging approach to it. And this was something that was just increasingly causing frustration. So that was just in my experience, the polar opposite of what True North is. Where True North, we have oversight. Obviously, we have regulations that we have to abide by as a registered charity. We've got a mandate and a mission, and people who work for True North are expected to abide by that mission. But I've never had this like, make sure you say this or make sure you don't say this, because there's a level of trust. They brought me on knowing who I am, knowing what I'm about. And I think that's actually one of the great things about it.
Absolutely. And have you worked with Rebel at all?
Yeah, I actually worked I've never worked for Rebel as an employee,
Just
but
with.
when Rebel first launched, it was really an extension of Sun News Network, which had been on the air and had just gone off the air. And I'd known Ezra through that. And I said, listen, I'm doing my radio show right now, but I'd love to be a part of this as well. And I said, you want me to do a podcast? And this was actually a really formative moment for me, because Ezra said, yes, absolutely, we'd love to have you do it. We don't have any podcasters, but you're a radio pro. You can do it. So we had come up with this, I think it was once a week to start. And then if I recall, maybe we went up to twice a week, but don't quote me on that. And I would, record it myself. It was separate content from my radio show. And
Mhm.
I would send that in Rebel, and it would do all right. It would get, maybe a few thousand listeners at first for a new thing. And after a certain period of time, Ezra said, why don't we try video? And I had said that seems like an odd choice. I don't think anyone has ever said putting a camera in front of my face is a good business decision. But Ezra said, let's give it a try. And he said, don't do like your full podcast length. Do like really like targeted short 3-minute videos, 4-minute videos. And I said, fine. And I started doing these things, and they were getting 50,000, 80,000, 90,000 views, because Rebel tapped into something that was very, very important, which was just the power of video. And I
Mhm.
think the importance of brevity, because, if people want the full sort of video experience at the time, they could turn on a TV, they could, watch cable news. And this was also, I think, really interesting, because it just showed me the importance of flexibility. The answer is not that short is better than long. The answer
Mhm.
is that short attracts a different type of audience than long.
Yes.
And what I've taken from that in my own show is that, yeah, I'm going to do the full, hour-long show, but we're also going to take 3-minute clips of this and post it out, because there are some people that only want the quick hits, and there are other
Mhm.
people that you're going to, really disappoint if you don't give them something more substantive. So I did Rebel for a little while, and then ultimately, going back to the Chorus thing, they looked at me and said, nope, not happening. And I had to choose between this thing that I was doing, part-time, the thing that I was doing on a contract basis and not really making huge money from, or my career and my job. And ultimately I walked away from Rebel, and there were no hard feelings. I'm still very good with Ezra, and we have a good working relationship.
Well, it's a small world out there. We kind of have to be kind to each other, and they're doing good work. They're doing their thing, and I certainly like True North as well. Did you do any work with Western Standard?
No, never actually. I don't know why I had to think about that too long. I've never done any formal work with them, but again, you're right. It is a small world. I've known Derek. I'm a subscriber to the Western Standard, so I read their stuff. But no, I've never written for them or anything. Although I've appeared on there. I was on Corey Morgan's show when my book came out.
Excellent. You did the rounds with your book. That was cool.
Yeah.
And we got a comment here from Gov Corrupt. He said you were a host on AM 640 at one point.
Yeah, I never worked there, but I guest hosted on 640 for Mike Stafford, who, if you're a 640 listener, has now been canceled and fired quite unsummarily by the company, which was quite unfortunate. But yeah, it was 640, and there was a time when I thought I was going to get a job at 640, and then I didn't. But it's all things happen as they're supposed to.
And where are you located now? Where are you stationed?
I'm still in
right
London.
Now? Okay, very cool. Now we can go on to the election coverage. So we watched you on True North. You were the one that kind of announced it before CBC and the rest of them. Danielle's win, like 11:01. You were there saying, "All right, we got the majority," and then we heard the crowd as mainstream started to announce it as well. I thought that was a really interesting moment as the news came out.
And then, like,
then
7.5 hours later, CBC comes around on it. Yeah.
yeah. Sometime Thursday morning, they announced it.
They just called it now, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. So watching that real time, that is Canada's media. We have the truth, and then we have a delay, and then we have a good chunk of them. Then we have a delay, and then we have the main state media who finally reluctantly says, "All right, here's the case." First, as an audience member watching that, it always bothers me because that's telling me that we are definitely being filtered, and there's definitely things going on behind the scenes before the information gets to us. So that's the first part as an audience member. As a journalist too, just getting started into this, that also bothers me because we have the same access to the same information. We all knew when you guys were announcing it that it was done, but yet was that information not being trusted by the next step, by the mainstream? Do they have other access to other information? Or do they have to go get approvals before they release as well? I'm curious if we can try to analyze what is that delay and why does it exist? And why does CBC have such a large delay? What do you think, Andrew?
Yeah, well, it's a really, really important question. And I'll say something which for some people may be like, yeah, okay, this is obvious. But for other people, I think they may actually not know this. And this is that no one in media has the authority to call an election. The election is right now there in Alberta. We don't even have official election results. We have unofficial results because the official ones have to be tabulated. There are recounts, and then the results eventually have to get certified. I think going right up to the vice reign in Alberta. So this is not something that media has any legal authority to do. So when media say that someone is elected, when media declare it, there is a judgment call taking place. It's not official. I could have gotten up there and said, the Alberta Party wins with a majority, and True North would have declared it. We would have declared wrong, but we would have had that right to do that in the sense of, just as a broadcaster making a judgment call that we think is what's happened. So ultimately, when you have these declarations going on, the reason they take place at different times is because every outlet has its own process to do this. And in the US, this is a highly formalized thing. You've actually got and they always make a point of telling you about it on CNN, on Fox News, on MSNBC. They have statisticians, political scientists, analysts that they come in that staff what they're always called, like the decision desk, the election decision desk, the decision for election desk, and all of that. And they have a process which is not foolproof, but it's a process that they basically look and they go really down to a granular level and say, yes, 48 percent of the polls are reporting in Arizona, but we know that the ones that aren't reporting are Democrat historically because they're Phoenix. And this is where you get kind of people that really start to get concerned about fraud. They say, well, hang on, how have, the Republicans been getting 60% all night, and then, the last counties were Democrats 70% and stuff like that. And I don't want to wade into the American election thing, except to say that there is something to the knowledge of which areas are more likely NDP or more likely UCP. So we were looking at the ridings that were called. We were looking at the margins in those ridings. We were looking at the history of those ridings, the number of polls that were in those, and looking at the overall number and saying, we don't know exactly what's going to happen in each individual race, but we were, I'd say, as confident as we can be at that moment that there was no way that enough could change that would put an NDP government in power that night. And we didn't declare the number, but we said it's definitely a UCP majority. And having basically it be a two-party race was very helpful in that. So we made the declaration, and we were completely right. I will say that we and all of the media outlets were wrong about calling one particular race. We declared the UCP as having won in Banff Kananaskis because the UCP candidate there, Miranda Rosen, had a lead of like over 2,000 votes, and majority of the polls were in. And then they just literally dumped a bunch of NDP ballots in that were supposedly from advanced polls in Canmore. And when I say supposedly, I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just, I don't know for sure.
Just what happened.
That's what I was told. And then it flipped. But again, Miranda had given her victory speech already. So that was an issue that everyone had, not just us. So that's, I think, an example of why, take what the media says with a grain of salt, even in independent media. Do your own diligence. We were looking at the same numbers that anyone else in Alberta or Canada could have looked at. What set us apart is how we were interpreting those and what analysis we were putting on them. And I think that's so key, because I do not like the belief in media that journalists should have access to different information than everyone else. I absolutely not. And I think any journalist that won't show you their source material to let you make a decision for yourself is doing you a disservice.
Absolutely. And that's kind of where I was going at. Like, does the mainstream media, especially CBC, do they have a different source for this information, which might be delayed or fact checked before they get to them or something? I'm not trying to insinuate that the government writes their scripts, but we're trying to find out what's going on.
Results. No, not for election results. And now again, they may have sources on how to interpret this stuff. I mean, they may have, political scientists and statisticians and people with institutional memory and all of that. I don't want to besmirch that, but no, they're looking at the same numbers that everyone else is.
And that was coming from Elections Alberta?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. And then the coverage, you stayed up nice and late. Alberta was happy the next morning. And then you came on my show like 24 hours later, which is wonderful. When it comes to covering elections, and we don't see this a lot in Canada, just more in the States, where people after the election say it was rigged, there was a problem with it. And thankfully, in this particular election, that doesn't seem to be the issue. Like, I'm not hearing even the other side saying this was a bogus election. They're just upset at all the white supremacists in Alberta. By the way, I'm not. I don't know any out here. Haven't seen any of that around ever. But yet we're still being labeled that way now. So how do you feel as a journalist, as somebody who's in the industry, when you see mainstream media do things like labeling an entire province because of the results of an election, trying to demonize the people of that province because of the results of the election? And is that just as harmful or even more harmful than election denials?
The freakouts of the last, I don't know, day and a half now have been quite something. And there's a part of me, there's a schadenfreude in just enjoying it, because people are just so unhinged about it in a way. I mean, I was looking at, and I wrote a column about this on my Substack yesterday. I was looking at all of these other names that people have referred to Danielle Smith and the UCP as, and they've used the term far right, they've used the term crazy, they've used the term radical, they've used the term fringe, and it's hilarious because Danielle Smith is actually far more moderate on some issues than even Jason Kenney was. So it just shows how these labels really don't mean anything. The New York Times called her far right, which is, I think, a particularly brazen example. I mean, this outlet that knows nothing about Alberta politics, but they're just kind of swooping in to make the far right smear and get out. I think these labels are very harmful because it shows that they don't actually distinguish between people who are genuinely on the fringes, people who genuinely harbor extreme views, and people who just happen to believe that, maybe lower taxes are a good idea. Like, everyone's far right. And when everyone is far right, no one is far right. And when you start to lose the distinctions and the gradations that exist in political views, you actually push more people to the fringes. You actually push people to the extremes because you've marginalized them, and you've said that they actually have views that are outside the realm of acceptability.
Absolutely. And then when it comes to labeling, what's their source? Should they not source the label as well? So if you're going to say radical, or you're going to say white supremacist, or you're going to say something like that, based on what? Based on what? Is there a source for
Yeah.
that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
but again, here's where I think people need to understand it's normative, which means it's an entirely subjective label. It's not, when you say far right, there's no dictionary definition of far right that is
Mhm.
universal. There's no dictionary definition of radical that is universal. It means different things to different people. I mean, for example, the term right wing, I used to use the term right wing to describe my political views because, there was left wing and there was right wing. And it was sort of an easy little binary. I don't use the term right wing now for two reasons. The first is that I think my political views, as I've evolved and gotten older, have become more nuanced. And it's not to say I've gone to the left, but it's that right wing just doesn't mean what I think it means, or what I thought it meant then, to everyone.
Mhm.
So it's not particularly useful. And the other part is that it's become a slur. And now left wing is
Right.
not a slur. You can be left wing, you can be far left, and it's fine. Far left just means you're uber nice and you're uber compassionate and you're uber tolerant. But far right means you're bordering on, being a Nazi. So all of this is to say that the media has set up this framework, and the political activists have set up this framework. And I think it's important to reject it. Like, periodically, news outlets will write about True North and they'll say, the far right True North. And
Mhm.
every single time we call them on it, they change it. They don't always apologize, but they change it because they realize that there's no basis to say that.
Absolutely. And it is quite annoying that no matter what, if they don't like it, they'll slap a label onto it. And
Mhm.
I don't think it's working. I think you kind of highlighted it a little bit there, that far right, it means almost anything. So it doesn't really mean anything at all now. But it is always taken as a derogatory term. So that's its intent. So the intent of it is to be a derogatory term. I kind of like the term spectrum ideologist. So you're on a spectrum. Okay. It's hard to just say you're here. It's kind of like when you go
Mhm.
to the mall, you are here on the map. It's tough to do that with a spectrum. And it's also difficult to put everything on a linear approach. Like, how does everything just fit in one approach? It's more three-dimensional. There's a lot more going on ideology than just a left and a right with a center. So I agree with that. I'm heavily conservative in a lot of my views, but I certainly don't consider myself far right in any way, shape, or form, previous or current definition. And it's hard to say you're in a camp, but you'll get labeled that way. And I guarantee you, if I get any attention, I'm going to be called far right. I don't have a lot of hair, so there may be some terms around that. Uh, we'll see where that goes. But as an Albertan, it doesn't bother me, and I know my neighbors don't seem to mind, because those are names being called by people who don't know us. The effect, though, painting us with that brush, do you think it actually works? Do you think there's people out there that see the media and says, oh, I didn't really know that about Alberta, I must avoid it now? Do you think they're really changing any minds, or do you think they're getting any traction when they do this?
I think it's a tough question, because part of it just comes down to how much legitimacy does traditional media or mainstream media have, and I still think to sections of the population quite a bit, and even to people that say they are more independent in their thinking, it's still very easy to get sucked into the mainstream media narrative and the mainstream media paradigm, even unintentionally so. I mean, when you hear someone linked with the word far right enough, you're just going to take it unquestioningly, especially if it's something you haven't encountered or someone you haven't encountered. So someone who's only a casual observer of politics, if they just hear, far right Danielle Smith, UCP far right, Danielle Smith radical, that's going to be the first framing. And it's very difficult to actually get people off of the first exposure they've had to a concept. So the problem is that the people that know what they think, the people that are grounded in their views are not really affected by it. But the people who are most accessible to that line of thinking are the people who are the most undecided and the least passionate, dedicated political observers, which is why I think it is actually a danger. Yes.
You could make up a good point there. So the power of first impression. So if your first impression is through media and you hear it, it's very difficult to change that one. Because you
And
actually have.
if I can interrupt you there, just
Mhm.
because I think you've touched on something really important. It's also that it stigmatizes the view, because someone may say, you see, and on the front of whatever the newspaper is, Danielle Smith is far right, and they say, well, I like Danielle Smith. Okay, I still like Danielle Smith, but now I'm going to be very nervous about telling people about it, because if
Exactly.
this is
Yeah.
the prevailing perception. So that, I think, is the real problem here, the chilling effect it has.
And I believe there's even an effect with religion around that. Like if you come
Mm.
out and say, I'm religious, I follow God, I go to church, there's a stigma there, even with our own side, that maybe you are radical, maybe you are Bible thumping. There's even one around that as well, which I find very peculiar. Because religions, lots of people follow religion, well over 50%. But yet it's still hard to say, hey, I follow God and here's my message. Because even there's a stigma there. We had that group in the States. I can't remember their name, but they were very vocal and very violent towards abortionists, and I think that hurt that messaging a little bit when it came to bringing religion to the table, because they were quite extreme on the religious side. But because of that, if you just say I follow God, immediately there's a stigma there as well. So I see how it's used to. I don't want to say, um, uh, I'm not sure what the word I'm looking for, like to make sure that they paint us with a bad brush. I'm trying to find a word there. But I think it's more than that. I think it's like you said, once you put that stigma there, the next step for that person is to get over that stigma. So there's a challenge, there's a hurdle now to get over before they get to more of the truth. So, for example, if you never heard of Danielle Smith before, and you hear she's a radical right wing racist, which is or Nazi sympathizer, which is some of the words that they were using for her, you have to then get past. Well, am I going to be okay with a Nazi sympathizer? Am I going to be okay with somebody who is radical?
Mm-hmm.
You have to get through that hurdle first before you even find out that, oh, she's not a sympathizer and she's not a radical. She's actually pretty moderate and she's making a lot of sense. So I think from my perspective, that's by design. That's not by accident. They're not labeling her because they're just annoyed that day and the particular writer chose those words. I think it's more of a, hey, there's this push to demonize that particular side and demonize those kind of leaders that talk that way. So let's make that the push. I was speaking to Wayne Cunningham yesterday about media in the UK. There's a consortium there that developed early in COVID. The BBC is involved, CBC is involved. I think they call it Truth or something. Or do you know which one I'm talking about? That organization?
A consortium. Well, I know there's BBC Verify, which is their sort of fact checking thing. I probably know what you're talking about, but I would need the
Yeah,
name to jog at
yeah.
my.
It just I know that BBC, CBC, CTV, CNN, all of them got together on a group, which was to
Okay. Yeah,
sure that
I
the
know
narrative
exactly what you're
was
talking about, and
controlled.
I'm trying to remember now. But anyway, it'll come to us.
Yeah, somebody in the chat might be able to put that in there for us. But for that to develop and you get cooperation at that level on a media organization level, clearly there's going to be just a small group of people controlling the narrative. And this is why we hear things like when something comes out, they all say the same thing. They all say safe and effective, safe and effective, safe and effective. So you're not in that, so you don't get those memos, you don't get those emails. But are you aware that maybe there is more of a global organization that's kind of pushing down what they call truth, and under the guise of making sure we only get the truth? We're 2 steps away from 1984 Truth Department when you see something like that develop. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big challenges that we've seen through the COVID era in particular is the weaponization of fact checking, which has always been politically fraught. Like I remember during the Trump era, there was this Toronto Star columnist reporter who ended up going to work for CNN as their chief fact checker or whatever, Daniel Dale, and he was fact checking all of Donald Trump's lies. That was his full time job. And I think since Trump left, I don't even know if he still works at CNN. I haven't seen anything from him in a couple of years. But the one thing that was always so fascinating is that you're seeing these fact checks of Donald Trump where they're fact checking a joke. He makes a joke, and it's clear it's a joke to anyone who watches it, and they're fact checking it. It's like, oh, Donald Trump says he's really strong. Well, the fact check, like it's like, or something will happen where someone will be like, oh, we lowered taxes by 9.34%, and then the fact checker said, no, it was 9.12%. How dare, like stuff like that. And truth is important. Data are important. I get that. I'm not saying they're not, but this idea of the fact check got presented as this morally neutral and politically neutral phenomenon where it was nothing of the sort. It was disproportionately applied to people on the right. And then you look at the furthering of that by social media platforms, and all of a sudden you have social media platforms that are saying, we're going to take you off, or we're going to put up this warning label if you violate these rules. So the reason I think in the COVID era, as people know full well that this is so dangerous, is because yesterday's misinformation was today's government press release. The stuff that we were told was not factual yesterday is stuff that, eventually people come around to later on. Masks used to be harmful and then they were necessary. Vaccine mandates used to be harmful, then they were necessary. Border closures used to be racist, and then they were necessary. And now the WHO says border closures are bad. Lockdowns were good, and then Anthony Fauci says no more lockdowns. I never advised so all of this stuff has changed, and it's still amazing to see people getting like YouTube content strikes for stuff that is now generally accepted. And I think that when you bring in the media aspect of this, you had this cabal of media, of tech companies, of governments that were all singing from the same songbook, for sure.
Yeah, I think we'll be fact checked on your fact check statement there.
Yeah, I mean, like Twitter sort of has done the most constructive thing now in the Elon Musk era, where they put up these little context tabs. But even then, I get that you want to have some counterbalance if something false is going around the internet. But I don't think we've yet seen the system to do that doesn't involve starting to make these subjective judgment calls that really suppress or diminish certain opinions.
Yeah, and I remember the Covfefe kerfuffle. They were saying those are grounds for his removal because of a typo. There's no fact check on that. Now, I want to kind of move, if you don't, go ahead.
No, I was just sorry. It was that awkward thing where I didn't know if you were wanting me to talk, and then I screwed it up. So carry on.
No, it was my bad. I had a thought, and then I kind of changed halfway through the thought and changed to a different subject. So my bad. But what I would like to move to now is the Freedom Convoy in your book. Okay, because I'm going to kind of have to shorten the show a little bit, so I'll move us along. I do want to read one part of chapter 8, if you don't mind. There's no copyright issue. I got the author here. All right.
I need to remember what chapter 8 is now while you do that.
Yeah, dueling narratives.
Oh, yes. Okay, got it.
Yeah. And I like this one a lot because that was, I think, the biggest problem. There was a lot of things that were misunderstood about the convoy. You touched a lot about in this book. There was a lot of things that were unanswered at the time of the convoy. We kind of got some answers in the POEC. For example, people thought there was a lot of violence and the children were unsafe. We found out later that was a false narrative. But this one paragraph here, if you don't mind, I'm going to read it because I think this laid the groundwork for the entire narrative, including the POEC. A Terry Fox statue across the street from the Prime Minister's office has been desecrated. A drunken woman had danced on the tomb of the unknown soldier. Truckers had stolen food from a homeless shelter. and a man carrying a Confederate flag had made his way through the crowd, as had another man with a swastika flag. These stories were all the rage online, but felt a world away from the block party atmosphere on the ground. So you nailed all of them. Those were all the ones that we heard repeated over and over again. We saw the picture over and over and over again. Now, you were there reporting on the ground. You wrote a book about it. What was the real narrative? Was it close to what one side says? Was it somewhere in the middle? Or was it completely different and we were all getting a very inaccurate narrative from both sides?
If there's a spectrum, to go back to our discussion earlier about political ideology, and on one end of the spectrum, we have Nazi flags, Confederate flags, anger, racism, hate. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have a carnival. We have the bouncy castles, the pig roast, the saunas. It was far closer to that end than it was to the other. Now, that's not to say there was not anger. And that's not to say there might not have been people that had fringe beliefs. It's a group of thousands of people with no membership process, no vetting. I don't know what everyone there thinks and believes, but the carnival atmosphere was far closer to reality than the negative one that was discussed in the media. And I think that was why it was so threatening to people that didn't like it, because they looked and they saw people having fun. And it was interesting, like even in the Public Order Emergency Commission, you heard Jim Watson, the former mayor of Ottawa, talk about like how terrible it was. He's like, we're trying to talk about how much of an emergency it is, and people were looking and seeing bouncy castles in the street. So he inadvertently revealed how much difficulty they were having getting their narrative to stick, at least in the general population at the time.
Yeah, and that was a good counter to that narrative. Now, it doesn't mean that the convoy was full of just party people wanting the bouncy castle for the children. It actually can also mean that that was a message that was being set on purpose in order to counter the other message. What I'm trying to get at is, yeah, there were bouncy castles and hot tubs, but were they there because it made it very difficult to label this protest, when behind the scenes it actually wasn't about necessarily the bouncy castles. It was about making sure that the message was heard and the government comes out to at least communicate with the protesters. I'm just going to take us back for a quick second. It's called the Trusted News Initiative. So this was that organization.
That's
we were trying to remember the name of. Yeah, and it includes AP, all of them. Okay, BBC, CBC, all of them. The Reuters, Microsoft's in there, and it also includes Twitter and the Washington Post. So that was the organization I was referring to. Because since this organization went into place, the scripts seem to be very synchronized. You will get the same sound bites all over the place. So that is kind of where the narrative machine on a global level comes from. But clearly we have a Canadian one as well, because they were focusing on the narrative around the convoy. So what do you think about that? That there is narrative generation and then pushing down. Do you agree that it exists? And if so, is there a way to kind of get that out of here? Or do we need that? Is that a way of controlling certain segments of the society?
So one of the challenges when people talk about media bias is that I feel that there's oftentimes a bit more, I'll use the word conspiratorial because it's the only word that I can think kind of is adjacent to what I'm trying to describe. But people think it's a lot more top down than it is. And when you have a biased piece of reporting, for example, I would say 99 times out of, I'd say, look, 999 times out of 1,000, it's the reporter's own bias that you're seeing. It's not because someone is up there pulling the strings. It's not because there's a guy in the suit saying you can say this or you can't say this. And even in the case that I was talking about earlier with my own experience at Global, the micromanaging I was seeing from above wasn't you must say this. It was you can't say that, you can't say that. So I think that oftentimes bias is more inherent than people think. It's not just this top-down conspiracy. And I think that when you talk about these initiatives, that kind of shatters my prevailing theory in some way, because here you have something that is top-down in some way. And I don't know if it's changing anything or if it's there because they're already on side with that. I think it's probably a little bit more of the latter. You've got all of these organizations that are already kind of confident that they're in the right, that they define what the prevailing acceptable views are on things. And it's very dangerous because right now we're seeing an era, and I don't know if you can put up on the screen which outlets are involved again for people, but if you look at it, you'll see how many countries that spans. You've got Canada, the United Kingdom, the European Union, you've got the United States, you've got India, you've got tech companies. And all of that is quite fascinating because if you look at the political landscape in these countries, Canada, the UK, and the EU are all right now at roughly the same pace. Introducing online regulations. They're developing right now this suite of online regulation laws that are all under the guise of online safety. And all of them are expected to take a hard line against misinformation and disinformation, including the Canadian context, which even as recently as this week, Pablo Rodriguez was saying is coming, I think, before the end of the year. So I think you have to look at the political context of that you've got all of these news outlets in all of these countries that are banding together. Well, all these governments are talking about regulating, among other things, misinformation. And again, I'm not saying that there is a conspiracy there, but I'm saying that all of these groups are definitely working together by design, not in the shadows. They're working together as a matter of official policy.
Yeah, and what I've noticed they're doing is they source each other. So they make a statement and then source each other. So according to AP is what CBC would say. And then someone else will say according to CBC. So there really is just one person or one organization where they kind of source each other. Two statements I want to make. Conspiracy theories are truth. It's just 6 to 12 months delayed. That's what we've been seeing. Like, we will come out and say rational, reasonable, logical things. It'll be labeled as conspiracy theory, and then time will tell that it turns out to be true. And one more thing about this mis and disinformation. So CBC is one of the organizations part of this truth initiative. However, I was watching real time the POEC, and I was watching real time how they absolutely created, and I would say they're very good at making sure they're not making mis and disinformation by definition, but it's still another type of category. And here's what I'm going to give as an example. So Tom Marazzo was giving his testimony, and he was talking about how on February 9th, they were meant to move a bunch of trucks. However, the city, the OPS, so Ottawa Police Services, didn't provide the equipment and wouldn't move the barriers. There were barriers in the way of moving the trucks on February 9th. So his testimony was, we didn't move the trucks because, and then he explained the because. But the headline in CBC was, Tom Marazzo, organizer, leader, the guy that makes all the decisions, said they didn't move trucks. End of sentence. No because, no context whatsoever. Now, technically speaking, under the definition of mis or disinformation, it's neither one of those, because he did say that, but they edited the context in such a way that you don't get the full story. Now, what do we call that? Because that's not technically mis or dis, but it's something else. It's something more manipulative in my mind than even those two categories. And how do we then tackle that if that is exactly what the sources of all our information are doing? They're taking out of context on purpose, but they're skating that line of mis and disinformation so they can't be labeled. So what do you think about
there's
that?
a new word that you'll see pop up, and I think it's going to become a lot more common, called malinformation. And this
Malinformation.
one I find interesting because malinformation is information that is true, but is basically used in a way that is disapproved of by whoever is calling it malinformation. And it cuts both ways. I mean, the whole point they're saying is that if I were to make a claim that they don't like but is true, they can label it malinformation and try to, deny it or contextualize it out of existence there. But you're right that the media does that too. I mean, there was some joke. I can't even remember if Donald Trump told the joke or if it was told about Donald Trump. But, it's like, if he, or maybe it probably predates him many, many years. But, if he was out on a boating trip and, someone dropped, their can of beer over the side of the boat, and Donald Trump gets out, walks across the water, reaches down and picks it up. And the headline the next day is Donald Trump can't swim.
Yeah.
So there's an example that I think we see of people taking true information and, distorting it. But conversely, we also see a lot of problems of people trying to look down on truth, that even truth is no longer enough of a defense. And I think that's, I fear, where we're headed.
Yeah, and you make up a good point. You make a good point there. So, what should we do as independent journalists? Is there a way for us to assist in that in any way? Should we be trying to fact check them? Should we be trying to make a mission out of that as well? What do you think we can do as independent journalists to try and combat the malinformation? Because I think that one's a little bit more dangerous, because that one actually has malicious intent behind it. What can we do to help combat that?
Well, I think showing your work. I mean, to go back to the old thing that we were all told on our school math assignment, it's not enough just to have the answer. You want to show your work so other people know how you got that answer. And I think, generally speaking, I always hated show your work, because, sometimes you might have a different path to get to the answer. In the case of math, I had no path to get to the answer, so it didn't matter. But, you have to, I think, as a journalist, show people why you are getting to the conclusion you are. And they can decide if your premises actually lead to your conclusion or not. And I think, for example, if we talk about one notable aspect of this in the media, is government documents and reports. People will all the time report on this access to information requests, this set of documents, this report that the government produced, but they don't actually link to the original source document. And in the age of the internet, you have no space limitation. You have no inability to put a hyperlink in. It's very easy to do. And if someone doesn't do that, I'm like, why do they not want me to see the original? And it's amazing how often you can go and follow this and find it yourself and say, well, that's not really what the article said it said, or yes, they got this part accurate, but they missed this part, which offered a different perspective. And I think that's so important. I mean, they always talk about trust in media in decline, but never look in the mirror and see why that trust is in decline.
And we're just going to go back to your malinformation. People are wondering, does it mean malice? Does it mean possibly malleable? Malicious, or all of them?
Yeah, it could be. I mean, I think it's malicious, I think it's malicious, but I think malleable and malinformed and malodorous even work quite well as well.
Well, look, we are good at creating up words too. That means something.
Malodorous is a Mark Stein word. I haven't used it in a while.
Oh, cool. And we're going to get to Mark Stein in actually the next segment here, because I'm going now to, let me get it up here, Dame Melanie Dawes and Davos. So let me play the video if people haven't seen it. I have it right here for them. And let me just go put that on and I'll come right back.
I was just wondering if I could ask you about whether you think Ofcom is being fair in enforcing its COVID misinformation policy against very legitimate discourse about COVID.
Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean, to be honest.
Well, people that have spoken about vaccine injuries have received Ofcom complaints and investigations, and broadcast licenses are in jeopardy of people that talk about very real issues.
I just don't think that we've. I guess I'm not sure. It's very hard to answer that question without a specific instance.
I'm sorry to pause here, folks, because I just noticed something in the background. You see that black truck? You see the logo? World Economic Forum shuttle. Just pointing it out there. You're in Davos, aren't you?
I guess I'm not sure.
Yep,
it's very hard to answer that question without a specific instance. But
GB News is facing investigations.
Well, there are sometimes cases where we open up an investigation, but let's see how that goes. What we're absolutely clear about is that freedom of expression is incredibly important in the way that we deal with the broadcasting code. So people are absolutely entitled to express views. So we always abide by those principles whenever we're looking into anything.
So do you believe that discussing vaccine injury should be allowed?
Certainly, absolutely. Free and frank and open conversations are always good on any topic.
So they say the right things. You found her. So you know who she is. I don't think you were hunting her down. You kind of just stumbled across her, and then you had that interview with her. How did that particular clip go down?
So one of the great things about covering the World Economic Forum, and I've been to their annual meetings as a journalist twice now, and it's like this trade show of the world's elite. So you're like, at one point, I was in the bathroom and, I'm washing my hands, and to the right, there's the Prime Minister of Belgium. Like, it's just, he who did wash his hands, by the way. That was not the point of the story was not to out him as being unhygienic or anything like that. But you just see all these people running around, and the worst part is when you're going and you see someone, you're like, who is that? And it's like, and then you just, in the moment they walk by, it takes you a moment too long to realize, oh, that was the head of the IMF or something. And, it's like, so you have to do a few things very quickly. You have to recognize, identify, figure out what you want to ask them, and then make the approach. So you don't often get them. But in the case of Melanie Dawes, Dame Melanie Dawes, she is the head of Ofcom, which to Canadians is the British version of the CRTC.
Right.
But unlike the CRTC, Ofcom has a mandate that extends to content. And Ofcom actually regulates the substance of broadcasts as well as just the use of the airwaves like the CRTC does. And why that's important is because I fear that's sort of where C11 is taking us in expanding the CRTC's regulatory capacity. And Britain is also doing what Canada has done in starting to put the internet within Ofcom's purview. So I think the UK-Canada comparison here is an important one. But anyway, so Ofcom was at the time, this was in January, investigating GB News, which is a more conservative leaning television station in the UK, over shows that Mark Stein, who used to be a presenter on GB News, was hosting on the subject of vaccine injuries. And again, forcing them to go through this regulatory rigmarole, threatening the station's broadcast license. And I talked to her and I say, okay, what do you have to say about this? And you're right. Her answer is, well, we're all for freedom of expression. I say, even on this? She says, yes. So I'm like, great. I go home or go back to the Airbnb and I send that off to Mark. I say, great news. I think Ofcom might be dropping your investigation. They said they support free and frank and fair discussion. Now you fast forward a couple of months, and Ofcom has found both of those investigations. They found Mark and GB News guilty of the crime of wrongthink. So it was just lip service, as we say.
Well, I guess we need to define what free and fair mean, because apparently we both have different meanings to that. Both sides have different meanings to that. So do you think she was just there on vacation and you just stumbled across? Like, what's Foxconn doing in Davos for that meeting?
Yeah, I don't know. And to be honest, I don't recall seeing her, and I may be wrong about this, but I don't recall seeing her on the agenda as a speaker. But there are a lot of people who are there as attendees that aren't speaking. Like, that's not in and of itself unsurprising. But I don't know. I mean, why does some, government bureaucrat need to be cavorting with global elites? Why does she need to be there with the executives of Microsoft and the Prime Minister of Belgium and Salesforce and Klaus Schwab? I don't have a good answer to that. I don't think they do either.
So you've been there twice now. What did you pick up while you were there? What did you learn about what WEF is? We have their website. We have the book. The book, if you haven't read it, it's a pretty interesting read.
I knew you were a global elite.
Absolutely. I'm a deep fake, actually. I'm not.
You've got the roadmap right up there above you. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, no, I study the enemy. Okay. You got to study everything. And when they write a book and they tell you what they're doing, you should pay attention to see what they say they're doing. But now that you've been there twice, what is your take on them? Are they, as somebody told me the other day, they're nothing but the global library of guidance, so don't worry about them, which is what I was told by one gentleman. And then we also have the other side of it, which is, wow, this is just another iteration of the elite taking control of the globe. This is just a new world order, another iteration of that. So what's your take on that? Are they really have some good goals, which is to just collect information and create guidance for governments, or are they something a little bit more sinister? What is your take as someone who's attended twice now?
Yeah, so I think that, again, the WEF is a very strange phenomenon, and I've gone back and forth about whether I should write a book about this, because I find it's very easy to misunderstand, and it's very easy to give them a lot more credit than they deserve. For strings, and part of that is that they've got like the very worst face for the organization they could, which is a guy who looks, sounds, and acts like a Bond villain in Klaus Schwab, and who says incredibly creepy things like, we will penetrate the cabinets, and mentions Justin Trudeau specifically, and then goes up there and says, the future is built by us, the people in this room. So Klaus Schwab talks as though he's a lot more powerful than I think he is, but he is influential. And the one thing that I think is so fascinating about Davos is that it has no legitimacy or authority in any official capacity. It's not, whatever you think of the United Nations has an official mandate and an official charter, and it's formed by governments that have come together and said, they're members of the UN. The WEF is just there. You could create your own World Economic Forum. You could create.
Oh no, you outed me. Oh no.
Yeah, but I could create it and just set up, because it's a corporation. It's not a government. It's not an intergovernmental organization. But why does Klaus Schwab get to have the table at which the world's most powerful people sit? And I think there's a strange bit of business going on there where businesses pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to be there. They pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to be members of the WEF. Politicians attend for free. And on the surface, and in any meaningful context, you have to look at what these businesses are getting out of it. Businesses sometimes might make bad business decisions, but they aren't in the interest of paying for things when they get nothing in return. And that's because the politicians are the product being sold. And it's not to say that when Chrystia Freeland goes there that, she is beholden to Microsoft, or she's beholden to Salesforce or Zoom or all of these other companies, but they've paid to be in a room with her. And she has decided to be there. She's decided to be a trustee of that organization. The former Prime Minister of Britain, Tony Blair, I saw him. He wasn't interested in chatting when I, traced him down. And all these other world leaders, they're interested in being there. So what are they getting out of it? And that's the question that I ask as a Canadian. I say, okay, set aside the conspiratorial thinking of, Klaus Schwab pulling the strings of Canada. What is Canada getting out of this? What is Chrystia Freeland getting out of this for Canada or personally? And we know as a country, we're not getting anything out of it. So then you have to say, what is she getting personally? And I think a lot of these people are there because they want to rub shoulders with the elites, but a lot of them are there because they have set up this kind of shadow UN. And they've set up this parallel world in which they get to act like a government without being one.
Yeah, because they're non-elected and they weren't established by elected governments like the UN. So there really is no people say in the WEF at all.
Yeah, you can't vote Klaus Schwab out.
Correct. But where we have a deep connection is the Global Fund. So the Global Fund that we contribute to, we've been contributing to since 2001 under Harper, and we contribute billions. That is led by the executive director of that is like Chrystia Freeland, one of the fellows inside the WEF. So here's Canada elected officials taking our tax money and putting it into this Global Fund. And we didn't vote on that, and there's a strong tie between the Global Fund and the WEF. And the Global Fund puts on their website, we are working towards vaccination, the COVID issue, and we are very pleased with the current outcome of the experiment. I'm not sure why they're using the word experiment about this whole COVID thing. And they were pleased that the results of it were a success because the experiment was for compliance, not for health. And they're going to continue with that program using the billions that various countries, including Canada, has contributed to them. So yes, they're just a business and anybody can start them. And we're not quite sure how they're getting so popular and have influence. But since 2001, Canada, US, UK, all of us have been contributing to this thing called the Global Fund, which is now using those funds to push the vaccination and the compliance of lockdown mandates or experiments. Sorry, I won't call it mandates. They didn't call it mandates either. They called it experiment. So we'll use their word. So we are. It's. I think what you're saying is, yeah, they're arm's length as a business, but their stated goal, is to combine private and public and help guide it through private public. And you're not wrong. The product are the politicians because they're the ones that produce the guidance on the government level, or at least they bring forward the guidance and then try to convince people to follow it. One great example is the 30% reduction in nitrogen. There's no fact or reason for that particular number, specifically here in Canada. And when I contacted Agriculture Canada, I spoke to, and this is on my Twitter feed, so you can find it there. Brock, I can't remember his last name. Agriculture Canada lead scientist. So I'm asking him specifically from the farmers, why 30%? Can you explain to us where did this magic number come from? Because fertilizer is regional based. It's based on the soil, it's based on the weather, it's based on the crop, it's based on so many things that you can't have an arbitrary number like 30% be applied. The pushback I got from him was, we don't have enough time to get you that answer because the request for proposals ending in like 2 or 3 weeks, or request for comments is ending in 2 or 3 weeks. So we don't have time to get you that answer. But if you're interested in finding out that answer, you can Google global resources. So for a scientist of Agriculture Canada, they're pushing down a 30% reduction of fertilizer on farmers, and they can't put me to a source or send me to a source other than Google for the information. I find that incredibly perplexing and concerning that in Canada, we're now going to shoot for this target, but nobody in Canada can tell me why we're doing that. And they're telling me to go globally to get that information if I really care. I don't like that, because Davos or UK or wherever these meetings are happening, they're not sampling our soil, they're not checking out our water, they're not looking at the crops, and they're certainly not listening to the farmers who've been doing this forever. So that makes me very nervous when our government says, yes, 30% reduction across the board, but they won't give you the why, they won't give you the source, and they also won't give you the reassurance that yields won't also fall by 30%. So with all of that said, any guidance coming from the guy in the black outfit that looks like a villain or not, why is Canada not doing, like on our level, a fact check of what's coming down, review what's coming down, and then change it for our needs, because it's all very regionally based. So with all that said, what's your take on the fact that, for example, the fertilizer issue, we are taking guidance from one group and we don't even know why. We're just blindly following it, and that makes me scared.
Yeah, will you allow me to take a slight deviation at first and tell a Davos story before I come back to the question more directly? Because my first time at Davos was in May, and I was I was watching this one panel on all the panels are like basically the same panel with different names and different people. It's all like, this one was, I think, accelerating the just transition was what this one was called, if I recall. It was basically about furthering or more quickly getting off of oil and gas. And they had a bunch of these different energy ministers from different countries, including the petroleum and gas minister in India. And it was interesting, in India, they call him the petroleum and gas minister because they realize that it's a country that relies on fossil fuel still. And Minister Puri was talking about in this panel, we need to accelerate the transition. We need to move quickly. We need to get off of our reliance on oil and gas, and we need to do it more quickly than, even the estimates are saying. And I'm like, okay, whatever. And, later on that day, I see him walking on the streets of Davos, and I have my, I didn't have a cameraman with me that time. So I just had my iPhone and my microphone. And I said, Minister, and I can't even remember my question. It was something along the lines of, is this even a realistic goal? What you're saying. It was just sort of a soft opener. And he turned to me and he said, I said what I said, but if you talk to people in the developing world about this topic, they're going to look at it very differently than people at Davos do. Completely flipped from what he said in the room, and admits that what he said in the room has no meaning to people on the streets in the countries around the world, India or otherwise. And the reason I tell that story in answer to your question is because there is even a tacit or explicit understanding that these things in the room are entirely disconnected from the reality of the world. But the people in the real world have to deal with the consequences of these things. I mean, 30% is arbitrary and it sounds great, but that 30% is very meaningful to the farmer in Canada, to the farmer in the United States, to the farmer in India or Venezuela or anywhere else. And it is very dangerous. And same as when they talk about climate. I mean, this whole keep global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial level. That's an arbitrary number. 1.5 degrees. It's 2 degrees, half a degree. Why does it matter? Net zero by 2035. I mean, these are all made up figures, but we destroy our economy in very real ways to get to this fictional aspirational goal, which none of our economic competitors like China and India care about.
Correct. Yeah, the whole Brink group, right? They have their own thing. They're doing their own thing. They're not signed up to the Paris Accord. They're not pushing the Davos messages at all. Is that just because they weren't invited, or is that because they see things quite differently and they're a little bit more reasonable about what they're doing? I'm trying really hard not to become accused of being a supporter of states that may have some human rights issues, but I certainly look at them and say, hey, look, why are you doing it differently? Is it because you're not invited to the meetings, or
No,
is there a
they
lot more
are.
going
They
on behind
are
the scenes?
invited. They are invited. I mean, Xi Jinping, and so the first Davos I ever covered was a virtual Davos in 2021, in which Putin and Xi Jinping both gave keynote addresses. So and these people are very much invited. They're very much parts of it. And the fascinating thing about this, Jason, is that when you look at all of the talking that takes place at the COP summits on climate, at these other summits, at the WEF, China says all the right things. They talk about, oh yes, we're going to phase down coal and we're going to go net zero and all of that, and then they turn around and build coal plants. So China is the beneficiary of our economic suicide on energy everywhere else in the world.
Good point. Yeah, I did forget about that. So they did go there, but are they still active? Were they there for the since the Russia war started? Are they still as involved? Because that would be quite the indicator if even with the war, they're still part of this global consortium.
Yeah, Russia wasn't in Davos in like since the war started. Chinese officials, there were some, but certainly at the climate summits, they're all there. I mean, the last COP summit in Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt, John Kerry was shaking hands with Nicolas Maduro, the Venezuelan dictator that the U.S. has a bounty out for. But he was shaking hands with him because when you're bonding over climate change, all other sins are forgiven. So frankly, if Putin were to come out right now and commit to net zero, I think everyone would stop caring about Ukraine in the global community.
That's that's actually disheartening. Like, if you really care about lives in Ukraine or whatnot, then you can just wash that away if you're getting your climate change. I'm going to now wrap up because you got about 11 minutes left for your schedule. So I'm going to now move from Davos to reflections and predictions about what we as independent journalists, what can we do? Where do you see this kind of going? And will we get back to the point where people can trust their government, the media, and even our healthcare system? Because right now, all three of those, the trust on those are very, very rocky, if non-existent. And I do think that we should live in a country where we can trust those things. But at this point, now that we've been burnt, it's going to have to be trust but verify. So how do we go ahead and, as independent journalists, contribute to rebuilding of that trust between our government, healthcare, media, and the citizens?
I think that part of the problem, and I go back to the showing your work dimension from earlier, is that, we have, a trust issue for sure. And I think that when people stop trusting one media outlet, they tend to stop trusting media as a whole. And I think, there are some people that say, okay, I don't trust legacy media anymore, but I trust independent media. But even then I say, don't give us blind trust. I mean, hold us accountable. Do not let us have the monopoly on truth. And the one thing I love in the internet age is that the bar to access news has gotten so low, in that you don't need to just shell out money for a newspaper subscription, which means you're unlikely to pay for 5 newspaper subscriptions. You're going to get the one, and that's the news. And think of for most of the time that we've had printed newspapers, how much people had access only to one narrative, one perspective, one voice, essentially. Whereas now I say, read the enemy, to use your term. I mean, read what the other people are saying. I mean, don't just say, I'm going to only hear what Andrew says, because I'm fallible. I'm a human. I try to be transparent about what I do. And I think that we need to start paying attention to that. And people, I think, respect on my show that I'll admit if I get something wrong. And it doesn't happen often, not because I'm right about everything, but because I'm careful. because I'm careful, because I don't go with, oh, I saw this rumor on Twitter. I wait. And I mean, the idea of just stringing together a bunch of random tweets and calling it a news story is, I think, probably one of the biggest contributing factors to the decline in journalism quality. But people that are not prepared to earn your trust don't deserve your trust. And I think that's really what it is. You have to reward the people that are putting the effort forward. And if there are people that think you should just trust us because they said so, don't.
Yeah, and I'm seeing that the society is kind of accepting independent journalists. So, for example, two situations for me. So I went to the POEC to cover it, and I had no problems. Nobody stopped me. I didn't have to show ID as a journalist. I was able to interview lawyers as they're coming out, people who were there. I was given no challenges as independent journalist. And then here in Drayton Valley during the fire, I reached out to the county and said, hey, I'd like to be at the press conference. And the first question from them was, who do you work for and what's your accreditation? And I said, myself and independent. They said, okay, it's at 1:30 and here's the address. So I was really pleased that, I guess traditionally that's their first question, like, who are you? But they accepted independent journalists as an answer. That's not the case everywhere. Okay. So if I wanted to get into certain places, for example, if I wanted to go to Storytime Hour at a library as an independent journalist, I'm going to be rejected because they will not accept unaccredited, because that's the bar they use to exclude independent journalists. So for situations like that, where we should be there is a genuine interest to be there. There is people who want to hear what we have to say, but we're not going through this government accredited process in any way, shape, or form, and we don't have that piece of paper that says you are media. So how do we kind of fight with that? How do we work with that? Is there a way to get an association of independent journalists become the accreditation, or is there a way to just simply, by having the function of a journalist, you should be accepted? Now, I do want to put a caveat on that, because I want to be careful, because if anybody can come in, well, I think that's when we're going to get the loud guys, the angry guys, the ones that want to disturb both sides. Okay, both sides. I'm not claiming one side has a monopoly on disruptions, and certainly that wouldn't be a benefit as well. So I think it's a fine line between allowing anybody who calls himself a journalist in versus trying to find a path for independent journalists to get access to spaces that were traditionally only available to accredited media.
Yeah, so in 2019, we had this issue where the Liberal campaign was underway. True North was still relatively young as a news organization. And the idea of traveling around the country to cover the news was just not something we had a budget for. But during the federal election campaign, we had sort of made a decision that we need to be holding Justin Trudeau accountable. And we had, fundraised to pay. So during federal election campaigns, media companies pay the parties for a seat on the plane. Basically. And when you do that, you are on the plane, and then when you're on the bus, and, you basically you pay for your own hotel, but your meals and travel are covered. And it basically means you're on the journey covering at all of their campaign stops. And it's not done for profit. It's generally speaking supposed to cover the costs of having the media plane and the media bus. But we had said, we'll raise the money. It's like $10,000 a week was basically what it cost, but we're going to fundraise this. And our donors, our audience said, yeah, we think it's important that you were doing that. So we will pony up some money for you to do that. So we were trying to do this. We were emailing the media office for the Liberals, and they weren't responding. And I said, listen, I'm coming to this campaign stop. I'll literally had a bag packed, and I go to a campaign stop in Brampton, Ontario, which is a couple hours from me. And I was banned from going in. They said, you're not a journalist. We're not allowing you in. Now we sort of called their bluff, and I said, well, fine, I'll cover it myself. And they were so surprised to see me at their next campaign event in Vancouver the next day, because I literally just, after that event, I just drove to the airport and, booked a last minute flight and got there. And we did it ourselves for around the same price for a little over a week. But at a certain point, I mean, you're not getting any access. He's not taking our questions. So we folded it up. So that was 2019. 2021, same story. The Liberals will not answer our questions. They will not let us at their events. we had the Leaders Debates Commission deny us accreditation in 2019, and we had to take them to federal court and get an injunction so that I would be allowed to cover the debate, and I was only by court order. So this is an issue that I've been grappling with. Even as large as True North is now, we still get turned down from places. And we have some groups that won't respond to our requests, which is fine. That's their right. But others that say you're not allowed to attend this press conference. So Candace Malcolm, who founded True North, launched an initiative called the Independent Press Gallery. And this is a group that True North journalists are members of. A lot of Rebel journalists are members. Western Standard journalists are members. I think we have some folks from the Post Millennial. We have a lot of freelancers. We've invited people with left-wing outlets. We say, listen, the only goal here is that you can't be beholden to government money. Anyone else who is a journalist can join this group. And we haven't gotten a large uptake from the left, but they're welcome, because this isn't, in my view, a left-right issue. I'm now the president of the Independent Press Gallery, and I would encourage people to join and not. I can't guarantee that it's going to be an all-access pass into government press conferences, but what we're trying to do is establish a counterbalance to the gatekeeping that we see from, the Parliamentary Press Gallery, the Alberta Legislative Press Gallery, which try to keep challengers out. They try to preserve their monopoly. And to be fair, I mean, Danielle Smith in Alberta has been very receptive to it. She would take Rebels questions, Western Standard, Counter Signal. She would take True North's questions. And even in the legislature, the Legislative Press Gallery has previously denied access to independent journalists, but I don't think that's going to be an issue in the continuation of the Danielle Smith UCP government.
I agree, and she's been very accessible. I've actually been able to connect. Hopefully, she'll be on the show at some point in the near future. So that's awesome. Okay, for starters, I'm gonna go sign up. Okay, I'm gonna go sign up. But that could get you in the door. That doesn't get them to answer you, though. So even though you're standing there with the camera, microphone, and a question, I also see them ignoring. So, example, Notley came out and said, "We will answer all questions from everybody. We don't care." And then there was a question asked, and she ignored. You also mentioned we reached out to, I think you mentioned the Liberals, and they had a right not to respond. I'm going to push back on that because it's media. I don't think they should have the right to not respond. I think that because it's media asking the question and they're a public figure and it's a media event, they should be answering the questions. They could answer the question with, "I'm not going to answer," but that's still an answer. So we can take that. So I agree that technically they have a right to ignore even your request for access. However, maybe they shouldn't. Maybe they shouldn't have that right to ignore a request to access. They should at least have to respond, kind of like a freedom of information request. You can't ignore them. You have to give a response, even if the response is, "We can't fulfill that request." So what do you think about that? Even though we respect their right to ignore us, what if they can't? What if they have to at least answer the question asked? It could be whatever answer they want to give, but they have to at least answer. And when we reach out to them for comment on something, maybe it shouldn't be a right that they can ignore it. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a novel concept. I mean, I was referring to the legal right. I don't think it's advisable
Right.
or recommended that they ignore. I don't know. I'll have to think about that. I mean, it's interesting. And I will say, when I'm asking governments, the federal government for comment in particular, the minister's staff, the minister's press secretaries, who are liberal political staff, are always terrible to deal with. But generally speaking, I've had good experiences with the bureaucrats, which have their own communications division. So in the Department of Canadian Heritage or the Department of Finance, because a lot of them, they actually have kind of performance metrics where they have to respond to things promptly. And in a lot of cases, I get responses from them. Again, maybe they're not good responses, but you do get them. So yeah, it's certainly something worth considering. In general, I don't like compelled speech. So the idea of having to say something, even if having to say no comment, there's just a slight sort of moral objection, because I think the right to free speech is the right to not speak. But again, I'm also very aware of the context that these are figures that are fulfilling a public function. So it's not an idea that I would reject out instantly without thinking about it.
No, and I love your instinct, which is to fight against any compelled anything. Like we have compelled speech for gender and other things right now. So I hear your instinct on that one. But freedom of press and freedom of speech, these freedoms are different and they align somewhat. But I think freedom of press, to be able to ask the question and get an answer, I think maybe it's not technically like a requirement, not for speech, but maybe we can start looking at that as citizens as speaking the fifth. I'm taking the fifth. I'm just simply not saying anything, and that itself can indicate that maybe there's more to it than that. For my American audience,
there should be a culture of doing this. I mean, regardless of the law, they should want to. They should not want to shut down, and it shouldn't be consequence free. Like what Rachel Notley did, kicking out journalists, should not be without consequences. And the fact that she lost the election, I think, is actually a very important reflection. Now, did she lose because people didn't like what she did to Keean Bexley? Probably not. But people do notice that stuff. And it shouldn't be, you shouldn't get a pass on it. And one just story I can tell on this briefly. I covered for True North the Global Conference for Media Freedom, which was a big international conference. Canada and the UK were co-hosting in 2019, I think it was, to promote press freedom. And Chrystia Freeland was the face of this for Canada. And it was odd that at this global conference for media freedom, which gave me accreditation, she banned me from her press conference. And she banned Sheila Gunn Reid from Rebel, from her press conference at a media freedom event. And, it was interesting that we all showed up at the meeting place. Sheila, myself, and reporters from CTV, Global, Al Jazeera, Globe and Mail. And then the press secretary comes and she lists the people who are to follow her. And she lists everyone but me and Sheila. And all of the other reporters said, we are not going to this unless you let everyone come. All of those mainstream media reporters said, we are not covering. This is a media freedom press conference. We are not going unless everyone's there. And eventually they relented. Now, have I seen that display of solidarity since? No. But that's what you need to do. That's what needs to happen. Mainstream media need to realize that my press freedom is their press freedom and theirs is mine, and stop making this distinction of, oh, well, we're the real journalists. It's okay to ban them.
Well, I think some of them are intelligent enough that if you're going to start banning a group, eventually it might come to you. It depends who's in power and who's going to be pushing that approve button. And if you have a process in place where there's approve and disapprove, well, you've now kind of messed yourself up, because who's got that access to that button, and you're not always in control of that person. So having that mechanism in place is dangerous. It's completely dangerous. And this is one of the things that I think that sometimes the left don't realize. When they go do things like compelled speech or things that you're not allowed to say, what are they going to say when that's turned on them? When they put these mechanisms in place and government changes, and then the new government starts to levy or leverage those particular things as well, what are they going to do? They're going to be very upset. They're going to protest, and they're going to be angry, just like we were. But yet they're going to say, well, we have a valid protest. Your protest wasn't valid, but this one's valid, and the government should change. It's very hypocrisy. Like, this entire system is a hypocrisy. So as independent journalists, I think we are one of the prongs that can try and change this. And I love the story that for at least one moment, the mainstream media press did the right thing. And I'd like to see a lot more than that. Do you think that it is something that can spread? Do you think the mainstream media can be cleaned up? I'm not a fan for, oh, by the way, I want to talk about CBC's response to Elon Musk labeling them state media, because I think their response is quite telling. But do you think we'll get to a point where mainstream media itself is going to reflect and say, hey, look, let's just restart to this. Let's go back to sourcing things. Let's go back to being upfront. Let's go back to corrections. Let's go back to making sure that people understand that we're doing our best. Because when you get someone like the CBC, when they get labeled state media, and their response to that wasn't, no, we're not. Their response was, we don't want that label. I would have listened to their messaging if they came out and said, hey, yeah, of course, we have state funds because we are a large country and the economics are different here in Canada. And we need to support the salaries of people because we don't have a population that can support it like the US. I would be open to listening to a message from them like that. However, their response of, we're taking that as a derogatory term, and we're taking that as a thing that we don't want you to misidentify us as, instead of correcting what state funded means to them. That told me everything I needed to know about their mentality about the state funding that they're getting. They didn't defend it in such a way of saying, hey, we're receiving money, but it doesn't influence us. They said, don't label us that because it means we're controlled by the state. So I think their response to me was quite telling on how they think. Now we're just closing up. I know you gave us an extra 10 minutes, so that gives us 4 more minutes. But go ahead and what do you think about that?
Well, I think that one of the things that independent media has done really well outside of just the ideological approach and vision we have is come up with a business model that is successful and sustainable. And I mean, we were talking about Rebel earlier. Rebel has done something, even if you hate what Rebel does, they've done something really important in coming up with a viable, commercially successful model for a media company, and that's not involving bailouts. So at the very least, media companies need to be more nimble. They need to be a lot leaner. And, I go back to the many levels of global management I had to deal with that were none of the money spent on all those executives was producing content. And I certainly wasn't getting a lot of it at the bottom. So they need to come up with leaner business models, and they need to come up with business models that are more responsive to the consumer. I mean, there's something very pure, in my view, about crowdfunding and relying on donors, because it means that you are always going to be directly connected to the people you are trying to serve. And it's amazing when I see people on social media, like, knocking, crowdfunding and saying, oh, well, you're not, you're spending other people's money. It's like, well, that every media company is doing that. It's like, so who would you rather be beholden to, your audience or your advertisers or the government? I mean, these are the three options. There's no other option, or some wealthy benefactor, I guess, would be option number 4. So you can be beholden to a sugar daddy, advertisers, the government, or the audience. You get to pick one. And I would much rather be accountable to the audience. And if the audience stops valuing the work we do, they're going to stop sharing, $5 a month with True North, $10 a month with True North. And I think that's a really important accountability measure. And I think mainstream media outlets could do that as well.
Yeah, and that's been the uncomfortable thing for me, is asking for help, because there's expenses. I will have to exclude myself from certain things if I can't pay for it. Like if there's an event in Edmonton and I can't get there, it would be a challenge, and that itself will affect journalism. So whether or not the journalist can bring the information to you, the story to you, there's some logistical and financial restrictions on that, and I'm personally very uncomfortable asking for that. So that's why I'm asking this question. So how would I go ahead and sustain myself in the future as a completely independent journalist, not even associated with like True North? It's a tough one, and that's something. Go ahead.
Yeah, but people want to help though, and people really want to step up and support it. And obviously, people are hurting. I mean, the economy is not in a great place right now, and I get people that will say, listen, I've been a subscriber, but I can't. I've lost my job. I can't do it. And I say, absolutely. I mean, we all have to look after our own selves and our own families first before anything else. But I think that if you ask, you'll find. I mean, look at your comments right now. I bet there are people saying, yeah, I'd buy I'd spend the price of a cup of coffee every week to listen to your show. And there are, I hope that I'm making a bold commitment, not reading the comments right now. But I think that if you're producing something people like, people are prepared to pay for it. And even if it just supplements it. I mean, I started a Substack. And I said, I want to make it free. I don't want to paywall content. I want people to be able to read it, but I put the option there for people to do a paid subscription if they value it. And the reason I did that was because I started writing my Substack instead of writing columns for other people that I would have been paid for. I said, I'm willing to give that up, but if people want to contribute because they value it, it's there. And people do. And that's not why I do it, but it makes it viable to continue to do that so that I don't have to make those tougher calls sometimes and say, oh, well, I'm not going to write this because I have to do this other thing that doesn't serve this thing that's really my passion. So, I mean, the best advice that anyone's ever given anyone has been that if you can make money doing something you're passionate about, that's your career. That's what you want to do. And it's not always easy, but I think that's the thing. And a lot of people would certainly help support that in my experience.
Well, Andrew, and another way to get support are people like you who come onto shows like mine, who spend the time in their morning with people like me to help also get me out there. So I really do appreciate you saying yes. You've been very approachable. We've been chatting on Twitter for about a year now. So thank you so much for coming on the show. I want to respect your time commitment. And I think I've already stepped over it. But Andrew, thank you so much. And to all the people who are thinking about going from citizen journalist to independent journalist, people like Andrew exist, people like me exist. Reach out. Happy to chat, happy to provide advice, and happy to do what we can to provide exposure for each other. So Andrew, thank you so much for having me on, or having you on the show. And if you ever want me to help you in any way, shape, or form, happy to.
Yeah, and thank you. And just on the independent journalism side, I'll say, Jason, that the most important thing people ask every now and then about, oh, why don't you merge with so and so? Why don't you all do this? Or why don't you hire this person and bring all that in? And I say that the one thing that I love about independent media is that we aren't just one voice serving as a counterbalance to 20 mainstream voices, is that there are so many more of us now. And 2022 was a really big turning point on that in the convoy era. And I was meeting in Ottawa independent journalists and independent media organizations that I'd never heard of before. I'm like, who are these people? And some of them are like, oh, we just started, and now they've got 100,000 subscribers or something. So I think it's so important that we show how many of us there are. So keep doing what you're doing, and thanks for letting me be a part of it.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Enjoy your day, and we'll talk again another time.
Thanks.
Bye. Well, folks, that was Andrew. What'd you think? What do you think? Do you think that independent media is the way to go? Independent journalists? Do you think that we're onto something? Do you think that since 2022, when we had people like Viva Fry do the convoy, that really opened the door? I think so. That's what kind of got me going. I was inspired by people like Viva Fry and Zot, and there's quite a few people that were walking around with just a camera, just a battery pack, and the visuals and the messaging. And because of that, we have hundreds and hundreds of hours of truth we can go through. We have people like Stunt Dummy doing it. It was amazing to see all of these people come out of their homes after a lockdown and start journalism. And that inspired me. And speaking with Andrew was fun for me. We got Azario liked it. Everybody liked it. So now we have a little bit of time. And it's always a good thing when somebody commits to a certain amount of time, and then partway through it, they send you a private note saying, I want to stay a little bit longer. I can make a little bit more time. So we were very pleased to have Andrew on. And if those are the kind of interviews that you do like to see, let me know, because being an independent journalist, interviewing another independent journalist is something you don't see a lot of. So if you like that kind of stuff, a little bit behind the scenes in the media, and not just public figures, but actual media as well, if that's what you like, I'll keep doing that too. I'm working on some other people. I'm trying to get connections with them. And as Andrew said at the beginning of this, doing interviews like the one with Andrew does open more doors. So I couldn't be more pleased that Andrew gave me the time and actually let me interview him. And I got to tell you, I was quite nervous about this one because I got to interview an interviewer. So that was a lot of fun. Ellen liked it. That's great. That's great. So I'm going to go back to some of these pinned messages that I brought up that I didn't get into the show. So I apologize. First, we got Gov Corrupt. This is why they attack religion. They want people to pray to the God-verment. They also want to attack anyone who wants to shrink the state. Yeah, I've noticed that too, Gov. I think you're right. Because the religion for the left is a self-identity religion. They are their own gods, and their God government is the one that provides them the ability to have that lifestyle. So, of course, they're going to support their supreme God government in order to continue with their personal idol of God. I'm religious, okay? I was born Roman Catholic, didn't practice for a long period of time, basically became an atheist for quite some time until 2012, where things got really bad in the world, and I turned back to the faith, and it's been great for me. I was on a bad path before, emotionally, and now I feel far better. But it is difficult to bring it up. If I bring it up, I can see cringe faces and people that are like, okay, Jay, I hear what you're saying. I want to fight against this government. I don't like what they're doing, but I'm not comfortable with the fact that you carry a Bible. That's weird. But I wanted to approach that with him to see if he understood that is also something he noticed as well. And he did. And Padge had to say, I believe I'm entitled to my views, just as you are entitled to yours. My utopia would be a world where we can live with our individual beliefs without name calling. I agree with you. Now, here's a question I had for somebody on Twitter who was pushing on me from the left. They were from Edmonton and they were pushing really hard. I'm sorry about the screen. It seems to be shifting. And what my question to him was, do you really want to live in a world where everybody agrees with you 100%? Like, do you really want a world where we agree about everything? And his response was, no, of course not. We are individuals with thoughts. And then my response to him is, well, then why are you trying to force yours on me? Okay. No self-awareness. Okay. But yeah, I do believe that there's a hypocrisy going on the left. Rules for me, not for thee. And they're just not mature enough to see it. And maybe they'll grow up one day. I got another one here from Gov. With the religion aspect, I think it comes down to the fact that the government hates competition and they only want to grow. Yeah, I think the competition here is the have faith in me part of it, right? They want people to check their gospel, their rules, their laws, their requirements, their policies, and have faith in that. So people have a desire to have faith in something, but there's a good chunk of them that have it, I think, as Gov has pointed out here, they're misguided and putting it into the God ferment. And then another one from Gov. I think the left versus right paradigm serves no purpose anymore. I think looking at it as a libertarian versus authoritarianism makes much more sense. I'm also going to push a little bit back. Whenever you binary anything, you're creating teams and you get that tribalism that happens from it. You're not wrong on what you're saying here, Gov. I think you're correct. But it's a tough one, right? You have East versus West, left versus right, liberal versus conservative. And in some places you have black versus everybody else. It's this whole idea that we need to be in a team and pick a team, I think, is part of the problem, because you get into a very tribal mentality. When you get into that tribal mentality, quickly, you certainly start to throw away your morals, because you will do anything to maintain your tribal win. We see this in sport. Okay, so for example, you'll watch a hockey game and your team is fighting hard and you're like, rah rah rah, we all get that. However, your team may slash a guy and really cause some damage and do something outside the rules, and one of the first things we start to do is justify it, defend them. Like, oh, well, it's because earlier this happened or earlier that happened. Whereas when it's somebody against us, immediately we're like, no, that particular act needs to be addressed and there's no way that that should be in the game. So even on a sport level, we have this ability to ignore our own morals when it comes to things, overlook things, defend things that we wouldn't overlook and defend if it was on the other side. And I think there's a lot of trouble with that. Whenever you pick a camp, you start to defend that camp. And as we know, there is no perfection in the world. So your camp absolutely is going to have problems. And I think the stronger people are the ones that can stand up and even criticize and critique their own side. And they also try and stay away from being on a side. And that's kind of where I think Andrew is. I think that's where I think independent journalists should be. They should try and be in the middle, the unbiased portion of it as much as they can. Carry your personal bias, sure, but try and take it out of your work. Bearing Witness, the book here talks about that. It talks about the fact that we have biases and they're inherent in us, and sometimes they're difficult to work with. But there are some ways that you can take that and separate from the work and the mission and the role you're doing. And when it comes to independent journalism, as Andrew said, it's best to make sure that you're as unbiased as possible. We got a couple more comments here. Padge is getting some love here. Let's go here. Just start here. Tammy, I don't even know the last time I sat down and watched legacy media. I know for me, CNN was 2012. I didn't even get into Fox. It's been a long time. Good point there, Padge. It's been a long time. And I think that's why we're able to see more of the truth, or at least some of the hypocrisy. Tammy, me either, Padge. I catch little moments when I am talking with my dad, but I will not tune into it myself. And when you do catch it, like in an airport, or you catch it in some other place and the media is there, the mainstream media, it's difficult to watch it nowadays, especially when you have a lot more information on the subject matter and they're just not sharing it. And by the way, folks, a new camera came in today, so hopefully this whole brightness control problem I'm having right now will be gone for you tomorrow. Padge, I try every now and again to watch the old news segments if the topic is of interest, but can never finish it as it appears to come from a negative bias. Here's what I do. I do watch them. Okay. Like I don't tune into CNN or CBC and leave it on, but I do watch and read their coverage, because just like reading the book, you got to know what the other side's saying. And it also helps me to understand a bit where they're coming from. It doesn't necessarily persuade me to agree with them, but it's important for me to understand where they could be coming from, because that gives me the ability to then kind of communicate, work with them, collaborate with them, or try to, I don't want to use the word correct them, but to educate them. It's best to know where they're coming from. Tammy's agreeing with Padge. That's pretty cool. Ellen, there's a whole bunch of comments from you that I couldn't get to, but thank you for them. We cut the cable years ago. Don't miss it. If we want to watch, we can search for it, not be force-fed. Yeah, we did too. And that was about 2012. We cut the cable, started streaming everything. Because why are you paying for that garbage when it's coming in? And like Ellen says, you can always go find it. You can look it up, and you can consume it in other ways instead of being force-fed. And then much larger pool outside of the mainstream. There is. And I'm not sure if you guys noticed, but late last year, there was like a internal conservative podcast fighting going on. You had Tim Pool and Jeremy from the Quartering. You had Crowder with Daily Wire throwing, like, everybody's just kerfuffling all at the same time. I found that to be interesting, and it was a little disheartening to see a lot of these shows have some infighting. It seems to have calmed down now. Okay. Crowder's got his thing now. Daily Wire is still rocking and rolling. Jeremy the Quartering still doing his thing. Tim Pool's still doing his thing. But it is odd when every once in a while we see ourselves cannibalizing our own mission. But here we are. We got new shows like this one. So there'll be plenty of variety to choose from. Agreed with Ellen. Tammy and Ellen agree. Paula agrees. For sure, Ellen, the cable was cut years ago for us as well. Yeah, we did that. And Eleanor is very happy. Very good. It was really great that you all showed up again, too. I'm missing Clay. Did I miss Clay? I haven't seen Prairie in a couple days. I hope they're all okay. But yeah, we'll reach out. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up. Tomorrow's show. Who is it on again tomorrow? I know I got Kelly on Friday. Oh, right. Mark Friesen, the Grizzly Patriot. So I'll be recording his interview this afternoon at about 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock. We're recording. He's not an early bird. And tomorrow I'm going to try out playing a recorded interview for you. So, of course, you won't be able to have your chat live. But if you reach out to me on Twitter, Discord, in any way you want, and you can fire me some questions that you want to ask Mark, I will make sure I ask them. So tomorrow's show is going to be a little bit different. I'll be replaying the episode that I recorded this afternoon with Mark. And then on Friday is Kelly Lorenz, something like that. Again, you know me now. I'm bad with names. But he's the lieutenant for Western Canada, Northwest Territories for the PPC Party. And he's a very active member of the PPC Party, a very respected member of the PPC Party. He's just one step away from Maxime himself. He's one of the lieutenants. So we're going to be spending the entire time with him on Friday as well. So I hope you guys look forward to that and enjoy that one. And we have some kudos coming out of Eleanor. She liked this show. Great. Thank you so much for joining. And Padge is having, have a wonderful day, everybody. All right. Well, we got 5 minutes left, and 1 minute of that is for the new outro. We've been working hard the last few days to try and create more for the show, add to the show. We really want to, even though we're a backwoods, off-grid type of show, we still want to give you the best job we can. So yesterday I fixed the internet. It looks like it stayed up all show. It looks like we got 10 out of 10. So yay. Today we're going to fix camera. Hopefully we can get that better for you. And every day we're working for you. And we're not state funded. We're not even Patreon funded. I'm just too uncomfortable to ask. Okay. I'm just too uncomfortable to ask because I want to just give it to you. I don't want to make it feel like I need something from you. I just want to give it to you. But I think at some point we're going to have to figure this out. Padge, what are you saying here? Don't forget to like and subscribe to the video. Yeah, thank you, Patch. Thank you, Patch. Yeah, do that. Subscribe, please. It does help. It does help. I've noticed that we were being throttled on the Wayne video. We definitely were getting far less reach than we normally do. And that was the vaccine injury one. So yeah, please subscribe. Share with your friends too. Even if they don't necessarily subscribe to this particular line of thinking, it's exposure for them too. They should be trying to see other sources and hearing from other voices in Canada. And maybe this is one that will help them kind of think about or revisit some of their own thoughts. Thank you very much to my entire audience, and to Ali and to Andrew. Without you guys, people like Andrew wouldn't even take a second look at this show. So we do have some shows, we do have some good guests, we do have things we can point to now, and that is because of you. So thank you all for coming back. And I'm looking at you, Ellen. I'm looking at you, Peter. Of course, Padge has to. She's kind of obligated. But I'm looking at Eleanor as well. There's no question that Tammy changes my day, makes me happy each time I see her here. So all of you, Azario for sure, Brenda Smith, Hillock from Facebook, keep it up. You're the only one kind of doing that now, but that will grow and share as well. And of course, I want to make sure that Roxanne, there's another one from Facebook. So Roxanne McLeod Burge, thank you for coming and being here and being part of the show. We really, 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 really do love you guys. It's a lot of fun to do this for you. Do throw in some comments. Okay, so if you have questions that I didn't get to, you can still put them in the comment. Andrew will be back at some point. Definitely would like to work with him a lot more. Ali's reminding me that we have 2 minutes to go. So thank you, Ali. And what's this one? The special guest tomorrow. So we got Mark Friesen, and then we got Kelly. Next week's also all booked, but I'll save that for you tomorrow. I'll kind of announce everybody who's coming tomorrow. And Wednesday, June 7th is a really big show. I'm very excited about that one. So make sure you put that in your calendar and come live for that one. Well, folks, once again, thank you for being here. I appreciate it. It makes it a lot easier. Roxanne is happy. It's Rachel Gilmore, isn't it? No, not Rachel Gilmore. I've reached out to her, by the way. She hasn't responded to me. She's no longer working for Global. But thank you, Roxanne, very much. Motown, yes, you too. Sorry, I forgot about you. Just for a moment there. You're in my heart there, Motown. So I certainly can't forget you. Everybody, thank you so much for being here. And as always, let me make sure I got the right clip here. There's the outro. As always, God bless.